A house too quiet. The golden light of the late afternoon sun streamed through the large bay window of Adam Carter's home, casting long, shifting shadows across the wooden floor. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now held a hollow silence that stretched from room to room, thick and heavy like a lingering storm cloud. It had been 3 years since Maria, his wife, had passed. 3 long years of learning to live with the absence of her voice, her touch, her presence. The framed photographs on the mantel, moments frozen in time, reminded him of the life they had built together, one filled with love, purpose, and the shared dream of raising a child. But that dream had never come to pass. Now, at 52, Adam found himself sitting in his worn-out leather armchair, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he sifted through a thick stack of foster care applications. Each file contained the story of a child in need, children without families, without stability, without love. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, his mind racing with doubt. Was he too old to do this? Too set in his ways? Being a counselor for at-risk youth had taught him that fostering was not a temporary act of kindness, it was a lifelong commitment. The decision to take in a child wasn't something he could undo if it became difficult. But wasn't that the very essence of love? Choosing someone, even when it wasn't easy? A deep sigh escaped his lips as he reached for the next folder. The caseworker's handwriting was neat, but the words were heavy. Name, Emily Parker. Age, 15. Background, multiple foster homes, history of severe anxiety, selective mutism, and a deep passion for art. Adam's heart clenched. 15. That was a difficult age to be in the system. Most families preferred younger children, eager to mold them, to create memories from scratch. But teenagers? They were seen as a challenge, their personalities already formed, their trauma already settled into their bones. A small photograph was clipped to the front of the file. A girl with dark, shoulder-length hair stared back at him, her green eyes both guarded and filled with a quiet sadness. Her posture was closed off, her arms crossed as if shielding herself from the world. Adam read through the rest of the notes carefully. Struggles with verbal communication. Has difficulty trusting adults. Expresses emotions through drawing. Prefers solitude. The words painted a picture of a girl who had spent her life bracing for disappointment. And yet, one line stood out above the rest. Despite challenges, shows remarkable resilience. Resilience. It was the one trait that defined every child Adam had ever worked with. The ability to endure, to adapt, to hold on when everything else seemed to fall apart. A lump formed in his throat as he closed the file. He didn't know why, but something about Emily's story felt different. He wasn't even sure he was ready to open his home again, but for the first time in years, something inside him stirred, an undeniable pull toward the unknown. The following week, Adam sat in the sterile waiting room of the foster care agency. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Mrs. Thompson, the caseworker, walked in with a warm but cautious smile. She's had a rough couple of years, she warned as she handed him a cup of coffee. Trust isn't easy for her. I understand, Adam said, though he wasn't sure he did. Every child carried their own kind of pain, and no amount of preparation could truly ready him for Emily's. Mrs. Thompson led him to a small meeting room, its walls painted a dull shade of blue. A few motivational posters hung on the walls, their messages faded with time. The room was quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the door. Then, the door creaked open. Emily stepped in, her body tense, her hands gripping a sketchbook so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She was smaller than he expected for 15, slender, almost fragile, her posture slightly hunched as if she was bracing for something unpleasant. Her long dark hair partially covered her face, and she avoided his gaze, staring down at the floor. Adam's heart twisted. He had seen this look before, the wariness of a child who had learned, again and again, that adults couldn't be trusted. "Emily," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "This is Mr. Carter." Emily glanced up briefly, her eyes darting to his face before quickly returning to the ground. Adam smiled, his voice warm but soft. "Hi, Emily. It's really nice to meet you." She said nothing, only shifted on her feet. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat. "Emily, would you like to sit?" After a brief hesitation, Emily moved to the chair across from Adam, still clutching her sketchbook as though it were a shield. Adam took a deep breath, knowing that the wrong words could make her shut down completely. So he chose them carefully. "I heard you like to draw." He nodded toward the sketchbook. "That's pretty amazing. Art is its own kind of language, don't you think?" Emily's grip on the book loosened, just slightly. Encouraged, Adam continued. "I'm not much of an artist myself, but I do love music. I play the piano. Mostly at home, sometimes at church. It's a small place, nothing fancy, but the people there have big hearts. And the choir? We may not win any awards, but we sure enjoy making a joyful noise." At the mention of music, something shifted. Emily's fingers relaxed around the sketchbook, her shoulders losing just a fraction of their tension. Adam saw it, a flicker of interest, buried deep beneath the layers of guarded silence. She wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. But she was listening. And for now, that was enough. That night, as Adam sat at his piano, his fingers moving absently across the keys, his thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet girl with wary eyes. Could he really do this? Could he be the kind of parent Emily needed? He glanced at the empty chair across from him, the chair Maria used to sit in while he played. A quiet certainty settled into his chest. He had to try, the first step into a new home. The rain came down in a steady rhythm as Adam Carter pulled into his driveway, the windshield wipers working tirelessly against the downpour. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, his stomach twisting with nerves. In the passenger seat, Emily sat rigid, her dark hair shielding her face as she clutched her sketchbook close to her chest. She hadn't spoken a word during the entire car ride, but that wasn't surprising. Mrs. Thompson had warned him that Emily was selective in her communication, she spoke only when she truly felt safe. The drive from the foster agency had been silent except for the occasional hum of the radio. Adam had tried to pick a station that played soft, instrumental music, something that might ease the weight of the transition. But he knew that nothing could completely quiet the storm that raged inside her. She had been in 5 foster homes in the last 3 years. 5. Each one had been a failed attempt at permanence. Would his home be any different? Adam inhaled deeply, forcing his own doubts aside. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to her. "Here we are, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. "Home." Emily's fingers twitched around the edges of her sketchbook. For a brief moment, she glanced out the window, taking in the modest 2-story house with its red brick exterior and ivy crawling up one side. The front porch light cast a warm glow against the rain, and the flower beds lining the walkway were damp but well tended. She said nothing. Adam grabbed his umbrella and stepped out of the car, quickly moving to the other side to open her door. The rain pattered softly against the fabric as he held it over them both. Emily hesitated before stepping out, her sneakers making a faint squelching sound as they met the wet pavement. She hunched her shoulders, her thin jacket doing little to protect her from the cold. Adam kept his pace slow, not wanting to rush her. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel overwhelmed. As they reached the front door, he fished his keys from his pocket and unlocked it with a quiet click. Pushing it open, he stepped aside, giving her the space to enter on her own terms. Emily lingered for a second before finally stepping inside. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, the remnants of the scented candle Adam had lit before he left. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with old novels, music sheets, and framed photos of his late wife. A small piano sat in the corner of the living room, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light. Emily took everything in with quick, fleeting glances, never allowing her eyes to linger too long. "I know it's a lot to take in," Adam said as he set his keys on the entryway table. "But there's no rush. Take your time." She said nothing. Instead, she tightened her grip on her sketchbook and kept her eyes on the floor. Adam ran a hand through his graying hair, trying to find the right words. "I set up a room for you upstairs. You can change anything you want, paint the walls, add posters, whatever makes it feel like yours." Still, no response. But he wasn't deterred. "Would you like to see it?" he asked, keeping his voice light. For the first time since stepping inside, Emily gave the faintest of nods. A small victory. Adam led the way up the staircase, his steps slow so she wouldn't feel rushed. The second floor was quiet, the only sound coming from the ticking of a distant clock. He stopped at the second door on the left and gently pushed it open. The room was simple but cozy. A full-sized bed with a soft gray comforter sat against one wall. A wooden desk stood near the window, facing a view of the backyard. The bookshelves were empty, waiting to be filled with whatever she chose. "I didn't want to assume what you'd like, so I left the shelves open," Adam explained. "But we can go shopping for anything you need. Books, art supplies, posters, you name it." Emily took a cautious step inside, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the desk. Her gaze finally settled on the corner of the room where a brand new sketchbook and a set of colored pencils rested neatly on a small table. A gift. Her breath hitched slightly. "I hope you don't mind," Adam said, his tone softer now. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned that you like to draw, so I thought, well, maybe it would be nice to have something new to start with." For a long moment, Emily didn't move. Then, ever so slowly, she walked over to the table, running her fingertips lightly over the cover of the sketchbook. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. The way she lingered, the way her fingers traced the edges of the book, it was enough. Adam smiled gently. "I'll let you settle in. If you need anything, I'll be downstairs." He turned to leave, giving her the space she needed. But just as he reached the door, a small, almost imperceptible sound stopped him. "Thank you." It was barely a whisper, so quiet he might have imagined it. But he didn't. It was real. Adam turned back, his heart swelling. Emily wasn't looking at him, her eyes were focused intently on the sketchbook, as if embarrassed by the moment of vulnerability. He didn't push. Didn't acknowledge it more than necessary. "You're welcome, Emily." And with that, he left her to her space. That night, Adam sat at his piano, his fingers moving absent-mindedly across the keys. The house was no longer as silent as it had been. Somewhere upstairs, Emily was there. She wasn't talking much. She wasn't ready yet. But she was there. And for the first time in years, the house felt a little less empty. Adam smiled to himself as he played a quiet, familiar melody. It wasn't much. Breaking the silence. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting warm streaks of gold across the wooden floors. Adam stood by the stove, carefully flipping a pancake, the sweet aroma of maple syrup filling the air. The house was quiet, but he knew Emily was awake. He had heard the faint creak of her bedroom door earlier. He didn't call out to her. Didn't rush her. Instead, he let the house breathe, allowing her to come downstairs when she was ready. A soft shuffle of feet near the staircase caught his attention. He glanced up, watching as Emily hesitated at the entrance to the kitchen. She was dressed in the same oversized hoodie she had worn the day before, her dark hair tucked behind one ear. Her arms were wrapped protectively around her sketchbook, as if it were a shield between her and the world. "Morning," Adam greeted with a warm smile. She didn't respond right away, her gaze flickering to the table where a plate was already set for her. "I made pancakes," he added, sliding one onto her plate. "Hope you like them." Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. She sat down at the table, placing her sketchbook carefully on her lap before reaching for her fork. She didn't look at him as she took her first bite, but the way she slowed down, savoring the taste, told Adam everything he needed to know. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned you like art," he said after a few moments of quiet. "Do you have a favorite thing to draw?" Emily's fingers tensed around her fork. He waited. Still, nothing. Adam didn't push. He had learned long ago that silence wasn't always an absence of words, it was sometimes a language of its own. After a few more bites, Emily set her fork down and slowly opened her sketchbook. She flipped through a few pages, then stopped, hesitating before turning it around for him to see. Adam leaned forward, his brows lifting in admiration. The drawing was stunning, an intricate, lifelike sketch of a lone tree standing in the middle of an open field. The details were breathtaking, from the delicate veins in the leaves to the way the shading created depth and movement. "This is beautiful, Emily," he said, genuinely impressed. She ducked her head slightly, as if unaccustomed to praise. "Did you draw this from memory?" he asked. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she answered, "It's from a place I used to go." Her voice was small, almost fragile, but it was there. Adam smiled. "It looks peaceful. Did you go there often?" Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the sketchbook. "Not as much as I wanted." Adam could hear the weight behind those words, the unspoken pain of a childhood marked by instability, of places she had once called home only to be uprooted again and again. "Well," he said gently, "if you ever want to find a new place like that, I know a few good spots around here. There's a park near the lake, really quiet, lots of big trees. Maybe we could check it out sometime." Emily didn't respond right away. But after a moment, she gave the faintest nod. A small step. But a step nonetheless. A visit to the church. Later that afternoon, Adam grabbed his coat and keys. "I have to stop by my church for a bit," he told Emily. "You can stay here if you'd like, but you're welcome to come with me." Emily hesitated, shifting slightly in her seat. The idea of going somewhere new, somewhere unfamiliar, clearly made her uneasy. "It's really quiet during the weekdays," Adam added. "No big crowds. Just me and the choir director setting up for Sunday's service." He could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't trust easily. Didn't like being in unfamiliar places. But after a long pause, she finally whispered, "Okay." The drive to the church was silent except for the hum of the radio. Adam didn't try to fill the space with small talk. He let her take in the world at her own pace. When they arrived, the church stood tall against the sky, its stained glass windows glowing with the afternoon light. The building wasn't grand, but it had character, the kind of warmth that came from years of love and faith. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and candle wax. The pews were empty, the soft hum of an organ playing faintly in the background. Emily took hesitant steps inside, her eyes scanning the space. "Want to see something cool?" Adam asked, leading her toward the piano near the altar. He sat down on the bench, motioning for her to come closer. She hesitated but eventually stepped forward. "I'm not a concert pianist or anything," he said with a grin, placing his fingers on the keys. "But I do love playing." With that, he started playing a soft melody, one of his favorites. A slow, soothing hymn that filled the quiet space with warmth. Emily stood still, listening. Then, slowly, she reached out and traced her fingers along the edge of the piano. "You like music, don't you?" Adam asked, his voice gentle. Emily hesitated. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Adam smiled, his fingers never missing a note. Music's kind of like a home, isn't it? He mused. You can always find a place in it, no matter where you are. Emily didn't say anything, but for the first time since she had arrived, she didn't look like she wanted to disappear. An unexpected connection. As Adam continued to play, Emily slowly reached into her sketchbook and flipped to a fresh page. Then, carefully, she began to draw. Adam pretended not to notice at first, not wanting to break the moment. But after a few minutes, she turned the sketchbook around. It was a drawing of the piano. Every detail was there, the worn keys, the soft reflections of the stained glass windows in its polished surface. But what caught Adam's attention most was the figure she had drawn sitting at the piano. Him. Rendered in delicate lines, his fingers resting on the keys, a quiet smile on his face. Adam felt his chest tighten. Emily, he started, but she quickly flipped the book shut, as if suddenly realizing what she had done. It's not done, she muttered. Adam smiled. Well, I think it's perfect. For a long moment, Emily stared at him, her eyes searching his face. And then, ever so faintly, she smiled back. Not much. Just a little. But for Adam, it was everything. That night, as he sat alone in the quiet house, he thought about the girl upstairs. For the first time in a long time, she had let someone in, just a little. It was a small step. But sometimes, the smallest steps were the ones that mattered most. But it was a start. The walls began to fall. The days passed slowly, turning into weeks, and little by little, Adam saw the changes in Emily. They were small, almost imperceptible at first, how she lingered a little longer in the kitchen after breakfast, how her posture softened when he spoke, how she no longer flinched when someone knocked on the front door. But the biggest change? She was beginning to trust him. She still didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice had more confidence. She no longer stared at her plate during meals, and sometimes, if Adam was lucky, he caught glimpses of something close to contentment in her expression. One evening, as Adam sat in his reading chair with a book, he heard quiet footsteps approach. He looked up, surprised to see Emily standing hesitantly in the doorway. "What's up?" he asked, setting his book aside. She shifted on her feet, hugging her sketchbook to her chest. Can I show you something?" Adam's eyebrows lifted in pleasant surprise. "Of course." She hesitated a moment longer before walking over and carefully placing her sketchbook in his hands. He glanced down and flipped it open to the latest drawing. It was a portrait. Not of a tree. Not of a piano. Of him. Rendered in delicate pencil strokes, Adam saw himself sitting in his armchair, the very same one he was in now. The details were astonishing, how she had captured the softness in his eyes, the crinkles at the corners of his smile, the way his hands rested in his lap with quiet ease. For a moment, Adam was speechless. He exhaled, running his fingers lightly over the page. "Emily, this is incredible." She shrugged, shifting uncomfortably. "It's just a sketch." "No," Adam said firmly, looking up. "This is more than that. It means something." Emily's lips pressed together, and for the first time, Adam saw something unguarded in her eyes. A flicker of vulnerability. I don't usually draw people," she admitted after a long pause. Adam waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. She took a deep breath, hugging her arms to herself. "Because, people don't stay." The words hit Adam like a punch to the chest. People don't stay. The weight of those 3 words spoke volumes. Emily had spent most of her life being shuffled from home to home, always being abandoned, always being let down. To her, people weren't permanent. But she had drawn him. She had let him in. Slowly, Adam closed the sketchbook and met her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily." She swallowed hard, looking at the floor. "You say that now. But they all said that." Adam's heart ached. He wanted to promise her that he was different. That he wasn't like the others. But words wouldn't mean anything right now. She had heard them too many times before. So instead, he simply nodded. "Then I guess I'll just have to show you." Emily blinked up at him, her expression unreadable. But she didn't take the sketchbook back. And that, Adam knew, was a start. A trip to the park. A week later, Adam decided it was time to take her to the park he had mentioned before. "I thought we could get out of the house for a bit," he said that morning over breakfast. "There's a spot by the lake where I like to go sometimes. It's quiet. Peaceful." Emily hesitated, poking at her toast. "I don't know. I'll bring some sandwiches," Adam added. "And there's a perfect bench for sketching." That got her attention. She glanced at him, wary but interested. You think it's a good place to draw?" "I think it's the best place to draw," he said with a smile. After a long moment, Emily gave a small nod. They packed a picnic and headed out. The park wasn't far, but the moment they arrived, Adam could see the way Emily's eyes lit up. The trees stretched high into the sky, their golden autumn leaves swaying in the crisp breeze. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, ducks floating lazily along the surface. Emily took a slow breath, as if soaking in the peace of the place. They walked for a while, following a winding trail until they reached a quiet clearing by the water. A wooden bench sat nestled beneath an old oak tree, its branches casting soft shadows across the ground. Adam gestured toward it. "This is my favorite spot." Emily hesitated only a moment before sitting down. She pulled out her sketchbook and, for the first time, seemed completely at ease. As she drew, Adam sat beside her, quietly eating his sandwich and watching the lake. There was no need for words. The silence between them was comfortable. Then, after a while, Emily broke it. "You really like it here," she murmured, her pencil gliding across the page. Adam smiled. "Yeah. It reminds me of when I was younger. My dad used to bring me here." She glanced at him. "What was he like?" Adam chuckled. "Stubborn. Tough. But he had a good heart." Emily nodded, looking thoughtful. "Did you always want to be a pastor?" Adam exhaled, leaning back. "No, actually. I wanted to be a musician when I was younger. I used to play guitar all the time, wrote a few songs, even dreamed about performing." Emily blinked. "What happened?" He smiled. "Life happened. But I realized something along the way. I loved music, but I loved helping people more. And, well, here I am." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, she turned her sketchbook around to show him what she had drawn. It was the lake, but instead of just a landscape, she had drawn a small figure sitting on the bench, him. Adam felt his heart squeeze. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. Emily hesitated, then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I think I like it here too." Adam smiled. "I'm glad." A night of fear and truth. That night, as Adam lay in bed, he heard it. A scream. It was muffled but panicked, coming from down the hall. Adam was out of bed in an instant, rushing toward Emily's room. He pushed open the door and found her thrashing in bed, tangled in her sheets. Tears streaked her face, and her breathing was ragged. "Emily," he called gently, kneeling beside her. She jolted awake, her eyes wild with fear. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, as recognition set in, her breathing slowed, but her hands still shook. Adam didn't ask. He didn't press. Instead, he did what he knew best. He sat on the floor beside her, his voice soft as he hummed an old, soothing hymn. Emily's breathing steadied. She wiped her eyes, sniffling. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize, Adam said gently. She hesitated, then whispered, I don't want to go back. Adam's stomach tightened. She had been through something terrible. He didn't know what, but he knew one thing for sure. You're not going back, he promised. Not if I have anything to say about it. Emily's lip trembled. But what if they don't let you keep me? Adam took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. Then I'll fight. No matter what it takes. Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She didn't find any. And for the first time, she truly believed him. But would the system believe in their bond the same way? Adam knew the adoption hearing was coming soon. And he had no idea just how much of a fight it would be a battle for family. The days leading up to the adoption hearing were a whirlwind of preparation, anticipation, and an undercurrent of fear that neither Adam nor Emily voiced aloud. Adam had done everything he could, met with social workers, gathered testimonies from people in the community, and followed every bureaucratic step required to legally adopt Emily. But despite all his efforts, a nagging doubt lingered. Would the judge see what he saw? Would the system, with all its rules and rigid policies, recognize the unbreakable bond between them? Or would it send Emily back into a world that had already failed her too many times? Emily's fear. Emily had grown quieter in the days before the hearing. It wasn't the withdrawn silence of their early days together, but something else entirely, something heavier. Adam noticed it in the way she sat on the porch swing for hours, lost in thought, her sketchbook open but untouched. One evening, he sat beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. You know, he said gently, when I was a kid, I used to sit on my grandma's porch just like this. I'd stare at the sky and try to figure out what I was supposed to do with my life. Emily let out a quiet breath. Did you figure it out? Eventually. He chuckled. But it took me a long time. She nodded but said nothing. After a pause, Adam turned to her. You nervous about the hearing? Emily hesitated before nodding slowly. Her voice wavered. What if they say no? Adam exhaled, his chest tightening. Then we'll fight, just like I promised. Emily bit her lip, staring at the horizon. But what if, she clenched her hands into fists. What if you change your mind? The words came out in a whisper, but they hit Adam like a thunderclap. He turned fully toward her, his expression serious. Emily, look at me. She hesitated but finally met his gaze. I need you to hear this, he said, his voice steady. I have never once changed my mind about you. And I never will. Emily swallowed hard. But people. I'm not people, Adam interrupted. I'm me. And you're my daughter. Maybe not on paper yet, but in every way that matters. Something in Emily's face cracked. Her lips trembled, her eyes filling with unshed tears. And for the first time in months, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Adam wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as the last rays of sunlight faded. No matter what happened in court, he knew one thing for certain, he would never let her go. The day of the hearing. The courthouse was cold and intimidating, its marble floors echoing with every step they took. Emily gripped Adam's sleeve as they entered the courtroom. The judge sat at the front, an older woman with sharp eyes and a firm expression. Social workers lined one side of the room, along with the state attorney assigned to the case. On the other side, Adam and Emily sat together, their lawyer beside them. The hearing began with the usual formalities, background information, statements from social workers, evaluations of Adam's home, financial stability, and ability to provide for a child. Adam answered every question calmly, but he could see Emily shrinking beside him, her fingers twitching under the table. Then came the moment they had been dreading. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Emily. "You've been living with Mr. Reyes for some time now," she said. "Do you feel safe with him?" Emily nodded immediately. "Yes." The judge studied her. "Do you want to be adopted by him?" A heavy silence filled the room. Adam felt Emily tense beside him. Then, with a deep, trembling breath, she said something that made the entire courtroom still. "I do," she said, her voice stronger than before. "But only under one condition." The judge's brow lifted. "And what is that condition?" Emily turned to Adam, her eyes searching his. Then she looked back at the judge and said, "That he doesn't just adopt me. That he lets me keep my last name." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Adam was momentarily stunned. The lawyer beside him leaned in. "We weren't expecting this. Should we ask for a recess?" But Adam shook his head. He could see how much this meant to Emily. The judge studied her carefully. "That's an unusual request. Why is your last name so important to you?" Emily straightened her shoulders. "Because it's the only thing I have left from my real family. I don't have pictures. I don't have heirlooms. Just my name." The judge nodded slowly. "I understand." Then she turned to Adam. "Mr. Reyes, are you willing to adopt her under these terms?" Adam smiled softly, reaching for Emily's hand. "I don't need her to have my name to know she's my daughter," he said. "If keeping her name makes her feel whole, then that's what we'll do." Emily's grip on his hand tightened. For the first time since they'd entered the courtroom, her eyes were filled with hope. The judge's decision. The judge leaned back in her chair, silent for what felt like an eternity. Then she cleared her throat. "I've reviewed the case carefully," she said. "And based on everything presented here today, it is clear that Mr. Reyes has provided not only a stable home but also an environment of love, trust, and emotional support for Emily." Adam held his breath. The judge turned her gaze to Emily. "Young lady, I commend you for knowing what's important to you. And I commend Mr. Reyes for respecting that." Then, with a small but firm smile, she said the words that would change their lives forever. "Petition for adoption granted." A breathless silence filled the room. Then, suddenly, Emily launched herself into Adam's arms. He held her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake against him. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Adam squeezed his eyes shut, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Yeah, kiddo. We did." And for the first time in her life, Emily knew, she was home. But what neither of them knew, was that their journey had only just begun, a forever home and an unexpected twist. The moment the judge's gavel struck the wooden block, a weight lifted from Emily's chest that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She was no longer just another foster kid waiting for someone to decide her fate. She was Emily Carter. Emily Carter, daughter of Adam Reyes. And, for the first time in her life, she had a home that no one could take away. Tears, cheers, and a new beginning. As soon as the hearing ended, people from their church who had come to support them cheered and clapped. Even the social workers, who had spent years trying to find Emily the right home, smiled warmly at the moment. But the most powerful moment of all was when Adam took Emily's hand and whispered, "We're going home, kiddo." Emily squeezed his hand tightly. "Yeah, home." She had never said that word with so much certainty before. As they walked out of the courtroom, Adam was immediately engulfed by people congratulating him, church members, friends, even some of the courthouse staff who had overheard Emily's heartfelt plea. But Emily stood frozen near the exit, her heart pounding as she spotted someone she hadn't seen in years. A woman with dark hair streaked with gray. A woman with tired, sunken eyes. A woman who looked just like her. Her mother. A ghost from the past. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen her mother since she was taken away by Child Protective Services when she was 10. For years, she had wondered what happened to her. Had she gotten better? Had she changed? Or was she the same woman who had chosen addiction over her own daughter? And now, here she was. Standing just outside the courtroom doors. Watching. Waiting. Adam noticed Emily's sudden stillness and followed her gaze. The moment his eyes landed on the woman, his body tensed. Emily swallowed hard. I need to talk to her. Adam hesitated. Are you sure? She nodded. I have to. With cautious steps, she walked toward her mother. The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she whispered, Emily? Emily clenched her fists at her sides, unsure of what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Hope? Her mother choked on her words. I saw your name in the adoption hearing records. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I needed to see you. Emily's heart ached at the sight of her mother's trembling hands, but she didn't move closer. She wasn't the same little girl who had waited by the window, hoping her mother would come home sober. She wasn't the child who had cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had done something wrong. She was different now. Stronger. Loved. Home. Why are you here? Emily finally asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Her mother let out a shaky breath. Because I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Emily flinched. She had waited years to hear those words. But now that they had finally been spoken, they didn't fill the hole in her heart the way she thought they would. Her mother took a step closer. I've been clean for a year now. I'm in a program. I have a job. Emily's throat tightened. That's good. I know I can't take back what I did, her mother continued, her voice breaking. But I just wanted to see you. To tell you that I never stopped loving you. Emily's eyes burned with tears. She had spent years wanting to believe those words. And maybe they were true. But love wasn't just words. It was showing up. It was staying. It was being there even when things got hard. She turned to Adam, who was watching from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Then she looked back at her mother. I have a family now, she said softly. Her mother's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She just nodded. I understand. Emily hesitated, then pulled out a small notebook from her bag and tore out a page. She scribbled something on it and handed it to her mother. Her mother's fingers trembled as she took it. It was Emily's phone number. Not a promise. Not an invitation back into her life. But a door, one she could choose to walk through, or not. Emily had already made peace with whatever happened next. She had a home now. A real one. And, no matter what, she was never going to feel alone again. A father's promise. That night, as they sat in the living room, Adam strummed his guitar, humming a soft tune. Emily sat across from him, sketching in her notebook. After a long silence, she finally said, Do you think people can change? Adam set his guitar down. I think people can try. She met his gaze. Do you think she really means it? That she's different now? Adam sighed, leaning back in his chair. I think she wants to mean it. Emily nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She wasn't angry at her mother anymore. But she wasn't waiting for her either. She had spent too many years waiting for someone to love her. And now, she had someone who always had. I'm glad you're my dad, she whispered. Adam's eyes softened, and he reached over, ruffling her hair. I always was, kiddo. Just had to make it official. Emily smiled, feeling something deep inside her finally settle. She was Emily Carter. She was Adam's daughter. And, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.